the beginning of a nightmare. The late 70s in America, it was an era marked by disco fever, economic uncertainty, and whispers of the Cold War echoing in the background. Yet nothing prepared the nation for what would unfold on a perfectly ordinary day in 1979, high above the clouds, inside the cargo hold of an American Airlines jet. Picture this. Airline crew going about their routine, the hum of engines muffling anxious chatter. Suddenly, a sharp, unfamiliar bang ripped through the metal confines, sending shivers up every passenger's spine. The source? A homemade bomb, crudely assembled yet chillingly effective. Emergency protocols sprang into action as pilots fought to keep panic at bay, saving countless lives by the skin of their teeth. When the authorities arrived to sweep the scene, confusion reigned. Who would target an airline, out of the blue, with no warning, and why this method? The device wasn't anything like those in the ever-present threats of international terrorism or organized crime. No manifesto, no claim of responsibility, just a primitive weapon left in an everyday setting, as if daring law enforcement to solve the puzzle. The blast left behind a haunting silence, punctuated only by the skeptical murmurs of federal agents and law enforcement who could scarcely believe what had happened on American soil. But this was only the opening move in a twisted game. Days later, almost as a taunt, a similar device arrived for the chairman of United Airlines. With 2 attacks in quick succession, what had at first seemed like an isolated anomaly now looked like a sinister pattern. Fear tightened its grip on airports and airline employees from coast to coast. Security details doubled, luggage checks became exhaustive, but little could calm the collective nerves of a nation suddenly aware that danger could be hidden amidst the routine. Somewhere, a faceless adversary watched and waited. The bomb maker, soon to earn the elusive nickname Unabomber, had just begun to play his long, cruel game of cat and mouse. The recurrent question whispered in the halls of the FBI was simple yet terrifying. How do you stop a ghost? Name the nameless one. It didn't take the FBI long to realize they were dealing with more than just random acts of violence. As the evidence from the first 2 bombings trickled in, law enforcement agencies found themselves staring at a bewildering puzzle. The attacker hadn't left a name, a calling card, even a single coherent demand. Nothing but chaos, fragments of machinery, and a primal sense of menace. Facing a threat that had no signature and seemed to strike at will, the investigators needed a way, even just a word, to define the phantom they were chasing. That's when the moniker began to take shape, almost out of necessity. In the drab offices where federal agents, postal inspectors, and forensic analysts pored over blueprints and blast sites, someone scrawled the phrase Unabomb on a notepad, the shorthand for university and airline bombings. It was clinical, impersonal, and strangely fitting. Every task force needs a name for its quarry, and sometimes, a name is the only thing you have when every other lead slips through your fingers. Giving the case a label did something strange. It made the threat real, almost tangible. Instead of some vague, omnipresent menace, Unabomb crystallized into a singular obsession inside government halls. The analysts started linking past blasts, sifting through files from university labs, airports, and mailrooms, searching for patterns only visible when you finally name your demon. There was also a subtle, unspoken power in the act of naming. If you could define your enemy, maybe, just maybe, you could get inside their head. From that moment, folders stamped Unabomb piled high on desks, whispered shorthand code for a case that seemed to defy every ordinary rule. The public didn't know the term yet, but inside the huddle of agents, it became a rallying cry. The hunt for the Unabomber, a name that would soon seep into national headlines, truly began in that small act of definition. The first clue. The first real hints that investigators clung to in the chaos were as fragile and fleeting as smoke after an explosion. In the immediate aftermath of those opening blasts, the FBI and postal inspectors found themselves combing through scorched cargo bays and cluttered mailrooms, kneeling on cold floors picking up twisted bits of circuit boards and charred pieces of homemade clock timers. There were no fingerprints worthy of analysis. If any existed, they were smudged and half-melted. DNA forensics, in its infancy at the time, could only frustrate rather than enlighten. But a pattern, subtle and unnerving, began to emerge through the fog. First, there was the striking resemblance between the construction of the 2 initial bombs. Both showed a careful hand, painstakingly wrapped wires, switch mechanisms built from everyday odds and ends, scavenged from junk drawers and dumpsters. Each device, despite looking crude, demanded a patient, methodical mind. The design wasn't typical of angry amateurs or impulsive anarchists. This was someone who relished the puzzle, who wanted to communicate through the careful engineering of terror itself. At every blast site, investigators collected unusual evidence: wood shavings stained with glue, hand-carved metal plates faintly etched with initials that went nowhere in government databases, and fragments of old electronics. Oddest of all, in some explosives they found tiny pieces of rubber bands or bits of foam, seemingly trivial but, when later compared across attacks, strikingly consistent. Someone out there had a signature, even if he didn't sign his name. Writers of the FBI's earliest reports often stared, cross-eyed and exhausted, at these scattered clues. The question was always the same: were these crumbs purposely left as red herrings, or was the bomber's personality unwittingly bleeding through into the work? These early days were a maddening blend of hope and frustration. Each minuscule connection, a matching wire color, a reused piece of tape, was a lifeline for agents desperate to bring order to the senselessness. The public, meanwhile, was kept in the dark. The news talked about violence and evil lurking in the nation's mail system, but very little was revealed about what, if anything, authorities were finding. Inside the investigation, though, another, quieter tension was brewing. So many fragments, so many details, but would any of it ever be enough? The first clues hadn't yet solved the case, but they had posed a challenge, almost as if the bomber himself was saying, "Let's see if you're clever enough to find me." A journey of blood and fire. The years that followed the first blasts were a relentless, haunting odyssey that sprawled across nearly 2 decades and the entire American landscape. What began as 2 isolated explosions quickly unfurled into a campaign of terror, one that left scars both visible and invisible on the nation. With every new incident, the list of targets only seemed to grow stranger. University professors, airline executives, computer store owners, geneticists. No one could predict whose life would be disrupted or destroyed next. Americans everywhere checked their mailboxes with a flicker of dread, their trust in the safety of ordinary life quietly eroding with every news headline. Between 1978 and 1995, a total of 16 bombs arrived in carefully addressed packages. Each device was handcrafted with lethal ingenuity, cobbled together from scavenged odds and ends that looked like innocence itself, until they tore through flesh and steel. Some were small enough to fit in a manila envelope, others were packed in wooden boxes or disguised as books. Whenever one detonated, a ripple of horror echoed through the country, from the tiniest rural post office to the halls of America's most prestigious universities. The body count was mercifully low, 3 deaths in total, but dozens more were maimed, their lives forever altered by blindness, shrapnel wounds, or the ghost of near escape. One of the earliest victims, an engineering professor, would later say there was a time he couldn't walk past a pile of mail without a tightening in his chest. Families grieved in public and private, and for years it seemed like the bomber was always 2 steps ahead, vanishing without a trace after every strike. Each attack was meticulously timed, always with just enough lull between them that hope would start to creep back, before it was snuffed out by another explosion. There were years with no incidents, making the case grow cold, only for the silence to be shattered when everyone least expected. The investigators' frustration grew as fast as the public's anxiety, both groups forced to accept that anyone anywhere could be next. Attempts to find a pattern brought only confusion. The devices shared a peculiar signature, a strange mix of patience, resourcefulness, and a dark sort of creativity. But the victims' profiles were all over the map. Some were selected with surgical precision, linked through obscure academic work or technological advancements. Others seemed to have no connection at all, chosen for reasons that eluded even the sharpest FBI minds. The press dubbed the unknown culprit the Unabomber, and soon enough the word itself became shorthand for a unique brand of American paranoia. Movie theaters, classrooms, bank offices, and mailrooms across the country began rehearsing bomb drills and swapping cautionary tales about suspicious-looking packages. Weaknesses in America's vast infrastructure, so often taken for granted, were laid bare and dissected in living rooms and newsrooms alike. All the while, the maestro behind the violence watched the chaos unfold from a distance. The relentless journey of blood and fire was more than just a war on individuals. It was a psychological siege on the whole country, shaking the very foundation of safety and certainty. The hunt continued, sometimes feverish, sometimes stalled, always shadowed by the question, if neither motive nor identity could be pinned down, how could anyone hope to end the nightmare? Unabomber, the formless man. He was the ultimate phantom, a culprit who left chaos in his wake but nothing for the world to see. Not a fingerprint clear enough to trace, no stray hair to test, not even an eyewitness with a half-remembered face. The Unabomber, as he would later be infamously known, had almost nothing in common with the usual gallery of criminals the FBI profiled week after week. This wasn't some desperate vandal or an angry zealot looking for notoriety. Investigators quickly realized the Unabomber's bombs were feats of patience as much as brutality. Each was constructed from scraps, discarded metal, pieces of wood, wires that looked like leftovers from a forgotten toolbox. On the surface they seemed crude, but every detail screamed intention. Wooden switches hand-carved with a whittler's precision, glue stains carefully applied, pieces fit together so tightly there was never a rattle inside. By the time each package found its victim, the bombmaker had vanished into the noise of ordinary America, a ghost with a singular purpose and an uncanny ability to erase his trail. It was maddening for law enforcement, painful even. Year after year, agents stocked up case files. They would post photographs of mangled circuitry on bulletin boards, go through sketches made from the rare, conflicting accounts, reread the same autopsy reports hoping for a missed clue. But the heart of the investigation was always a void, the lack of anything, the absence that mocked the power and resources of the FBI. The longer the Unabomber went without being caught, the more his legend grew, stoking paranoia and dread not only among his potential targets, but in the very people trying to hunt him down. The case file swelled, but the picture of their quarry remained blank. All that existed were the calling cards of handmade destruction, and a chilling sense that whoever this person was, he understood how to weaponize obscurity itself. To the outside world, he was simply the Unabomber. But to the investigators who worked long hours in stuffy bullpen offices, he was the shape of fear itself, invisible, unknowable, and always just out of reach. The frightening silence. The early to mid-1990s marked a chapter in the Unabomber saga that chilled even the most seasoned investigators and left the American public suspended in a peculiar kind of dread, a season dominated not by violence but by silence. This wasn't the dynamic, headline-snatching quiet that follows a high-profile crime's conclusion. It was instead a void, a relentless and almost mocking absence, as if the faceless perpetrator had simply vanished into the night. In the shadowy corridors of the FBI and among the country's sprawling law enforcement establishments, the silent years became both curse and riddle. Case files swelled with leads that led nowhere. Phone lines grew cold, tips dried up, and the constant hum of fax machines, generating fresh reports daily, gave way to the monotony of reviewing the same faded photographs and scorched evidence again and again. Task forces convened, and then slowly thinned out. The sense of momentum that had carried agents through the flurry of bombings in the past decade disintegrated. There is a particular exhaustion in hunting a ghost, in waiting for a monster who might never strike again, but could resurface at any moment with devastating force. For the investigators who had devoted years to chasing this phantom, the silence was almost worse than the violence itself. Each day without an explosion brought only more uncertainty. Was the Unabomber gone? Dead? Incapacitated, or perhaps simply satisfied? Or was he watching, biding his time, taking some twisted pleasure in the panic that lingered in every mailroom and university office? The question was never answered, and doubt wormed its way into every aspect of the search. Old wounds reopened, and some agents, once energized and sharp, quietly asked to transfer off the case, worn thin by the grind of staring at a paradox, a crime defined as much by what did not happen as by what had. Meanwhile, the public's relationship with the Unabomber transformed almost imperceptibly. In the early days, news bulletins had followed every explosion with breathless urgency. Now, in the long lull, the story slowly dissolved from daily headlines into an uneasy myth. The specter of danger that haunted postal workers, university faculty, and scientists nationwide long after the actual bombs ceased. Safety procedures installed in response to the bombings became part of the mundane routine, an ever-present reminder of a threat that had neither a face nor a schedule. Mail was handled with gloved hands, suspicious packages isolated with the cold expertise of those who had already seen the worst. But behind the disciplined surface, anxiety simmered. There were still days, even months after the last blast, when a package would arrive at some remote university department and instantly trigger alarms, leading to evacuations, SWAT deployments, and the gnawing fear that history was about to repeat itself. The psychological warfare waged by the Unabomber during his years of silence could not have been more effective if it had been planned. Ordinary Americans found themselves looking over their shoulders, flinching at the ring of the doorbell, reading the return addresses on mail with a hesitation that became automatic. Paranoia, subtle and insidious, seeped into everyday life. Rumors flourished. Some believed the bomber had moved abroad, others that he had been quietly apprehended and the government was concealing his fate. A few conspiracy theorists even whispered that the string of bombings had merely been a cover for something far stranger, a distraction imposed by unseen hands. The silence was a breeding ground for speculation, for fear in its purest, most distilled form. Journalists continued to revisit the story during the periodic anniversaries of past bombings. Feature articles pored over the details, television specials ran somber retrospectives, and authors pitched books that might finally solve the puzzle. Yet the story always seemed to end in the same place. With unanswered questions, the silhouette of a shadow, the sense that the Unabomber was both nowhere and everywhere at once. Some reporters even tried to spin new narratives. Was the absence itself another message? Was the bombmaker taunting the country by withholding violence, holding the possibility of terror above everyone's head like a storm cloud that refused to break? Within the investigative teams, debates raged about how to interpret the silence. Behavioral analysts prepared psychological profiles based on what was lacking. No calls, no letters, no fresh attacks, not even mistakes with previous bombs that could be traced backward. Some argued the perpetrator was growing old, perhaps losing his drive. Others thought he might have been imprisoned for an unrelated crime or institutionalized, his campaign cut short not by law enforcement genius, but by brute circumstance. There were even those who worried that the next explosion would be catastrophic, the work of a bomber who had spent years perfecting his craft in the shadows. What made these years especially unnerving was the way the Unabomber's absence highlighted the machinery of American society itself. It became clear that the mere threat posed by one skilled and solitary individual could bring vast institutions to a crawl. Security procedures hardened, surveillance increased, and academic freedom was weighed against new and more restrictive regulations. The Unabomber, in his silence, forced an entire country to rethink what security and danger meant in the information age. Breaking point, 1995. The year 1995 wasn't just another page in the long, unsettling chronicle of the Unabomber. It marked a seismic rupture, turning what had been a shadowy campaign of fear into an explosive public confrontation. For almost 2 decades, the Unabomber had drifted ghost-like through American paranoia, known and unknown all at once, his grim packages bringing tragedy and confusion in unpredictable cycles. But in the spring of 1995, the entire narrative shifted with the arrival of a sprawling manifesto-style letter unlike anything investigators or the American public had ever seen. The document was delivered as a threat, a confession, and, paradoxically, as a plea, a 35,000-word treatise sent to both the New York Times and the Washington Post. Its arrival was itself an event, not a package primed with horror, but one loaded with intent to disrupt from the inside out. The typewritten screed laid out in dazzlingly precise yet profoundly disturbing prose the Unabomber's worldview, a radical anti-technology philosophy stitched together from years of solitary rumination. The letter declared that if this essay was published in a major newspaper, the bombing campaign would cease. Otherwise, more blood would be spilled. For the first time, law enforcement faced a demand that had nothing to do with money, politics, or even simple notoriety. This was about ideas, the kind that could warp, unsettle, or convert. Federal authorities were thrown into chaos. The FBI, which had already assembled multiple task forces and spent countless days in frustrated pursuit, landed squarely on the horns of a dilemma: ignore the demand and possibly invite more terror, or comply and risk giving a twisted platform to violence. Conversations in the halls of power became heated and existential. Would publishing empower other copycats? Wondered Justice Department analysts, while at the same time behavioral profilers debated if meeting the demand could help flush out the bomber's psychological vulnerabilities. Even the highest levels of government were involved, with the Attorney General and the FBI Director discussing policy precedent, First Amendment rights, and public safety for days on end. The debates weren't just about the principle of free speech versus the specter of terror, they were about the nation's core, The U.S. had never before been so openly challenged by a figure who, weaponizing anonymity, forced a philosophical question into the front pages of every household. Would America allow itself to be held hostage to a manifesto, even an intellectual one? In the past, terrorists had issued demands for ransom or for the release of prisoners, but here was a demand that required millions to face the unsettling edge of radical change. As teams of government lawyers, media executives, and national security advisors weighed every angle, the regular American lived in a peculiar state of uncertainty. Discussions in diners, classrooms, and boardrooms swirled with nervous speculation. Was it more dangerous to yield to a killer's edict, or to risk further mayhem by rebuffing him? The media, finding themselves at the very eye of the storm, experienced their own professional crisis. Editors at both the New York Times and the Washington Post confronted the weight of unintended consequences. The debate was no longer theoretical or even procedural. It was defined by the immediacy of lives potentially spared or lost. The Unabomber's letter itself became a strange sort of Rosetta Stone. Linguistic analysts dissected every paragraph and turn of phrase, hoping to identify patterns, hidden clues, or mistakes that would reveal the man behind the curtain. Psychologists pored over the document for symptoms, obsessions, and the tangled roots of a mind grown wild in isolation. For various readers, the manifesto bordered on the apocalyptic, a call to abandon society as they knew it, to retreat from technology's prison, as its author phrased it. But for those most intimately involved, it was more chilling than any bomb. It was the voice of a predator, suddenly loud and clear in an empty room, demanding to be heard. Behind the scenes, the investigation roared into overdrive. Every copy of the manuscript was passed through hands familiar with hundreds of unsolved bombings, hoping for some quirk of syntax or an oddity of vocabulary that might serve as a thread to untangle the entire mystery. Computers were programmed to cross-reference the document with databases of academic articles, letters to newspapers, anonymous manifestos, every corner of the written word where the Unabomber might have left an unintentional fingerprint. For the first time in years, the agents felt as though they were face-to-face with the adversary they'd spent decades chasing. No longer just a string of evidence bags and cratered mailrooms, there was a mind to map, a character to confront. The American public, too, found itself pulled into the drama in ways neither government nor the Unabomber himself could have predicted. Within days, the story swept across the nation. Talk shows debated the merits and dangers of giving voice to a terrorist. College campuses, tech companies, and even average families sat down around dinner tables to discuss the lines between legitimate dissent, activism, and outright violence. Everywhere, lay people wrestled with the uncomfortable truth that ideas, no matter how fringe, could be as lethal as explosives. The phrase Unabomber Manifesto became a kind of shorthand for a new era of domestic unease, where threats reached out not just through violence, but through the pages of the Sunday paper. Eventually, after weeks of high-stakes deliberation, the authorities made a historic call. The Washington Post, in coordination with the New York Times, published the manifesto, not as a surrender to violence, but as a calculated gambit. Officials reasoned that someone, somewhere, might recognize the author's unique cadence or worldview. In a very real sense, the American people became an army of detectives overnight. It was a strange, tense truce, fraught with tension and second-guessing, a nation holding its collective breath, wondering whether the storm had broken or was just gathering anew. The publication triggered an avalanche of responses. Thousands of tips poured into the FBI. Friends, neighbors, and family members across the country scoured their memories for anyone who'd ever voiced uncannily similar ideas. For all its danger, the tactic worked. Among the sea of responses, one stood out. A letter from David Kaczynski, who suspected that his estranged brother Ted might be the figure behind the myth. The pieces had finally begun to fall into place, but not before the Unabomber's message had been read, debated, and feared from coast to coast. The events of 1995 marked an inflection point, not just in the hunt for the Unabomber, but in how America thought about crime, technology, individual power, and the boundaries of collective fear. The idea of an anonymous loner, armed not just with bombs but with arguments, forcing a nation to listen, would resonate long after the last word was printed and the last bomb was disarmed. The Leader's Dilemma. Within the hallowed, marble-walled offices of the Justice Department and the labyrinthine corridors of FBI headquarters, The spring of 1995 became a test unlike any in living memory for America's top law enforcement leaders. The arrival of the Unabomber's manifesto created a situation for which there was no playbook, a direct public negotiation with an unknown enemy who held an entire nation in suspense. No one from FBI Director Louis Freeh to Attorney General Janet Reno, and the collection of advisors, lawyers, and strategic thinkers surrounding them, had ever faced a situation so public, so fraught with ethical, legal, and existential peril. The initial reading of the document, typed, rambling but chillingly lucid, triggered a wave of uncertainty and distress. Here was a deal. Publish the 35,000-word essay in a national newspaper, and the attacks would stop, refuse, and more would die. On one hand stood the principle never to negotiate with terrorists, a foundational virtue for lawmen and criminals alike. On the other stood a very real and numerically calculable chance to save lives immediately. In simpler times, perhaps the answer would have come quickly, but these were not simple times, and the Unabomber was not a man run by simple motives. Day after day, high-level meetings took place behind closed doors. The questions came thick and fast. Should the government let a murderer dictate the nation's conversation simply by threatening more violence? Would the precedent open doors for future criminals to bypass all channels and command the front pages of the country's most prestigious newspapers? Was it a violation of basic legal and moral code to provide a voice to someone who had killed and maimed innocent Americans? And above all, if the demands were ignored and more lives were lost, could the government justify that decision to a grieving nation? Lawyers pored over case studies that were in most cases nearly irrelevant. The hijackings of the 1970s, the famous Lindbergh baby ransom, markets for public ransom in South America, even World War II, era propaganda strategies. None of it truly described what the Unabomber was demanding. This was not a monetary ransom, nor was it political leverage in a conventional sense. The Unabomber wanted, and granted, an audience, demanding that his philosophical treatise be given legitimacy by mass exposure. It was a war of ideas, forced into the national square by daily threat of death. Janet Reno, ever the pragmatist, argued for empathy. Lives were in the balance, and the law served the people, not abstract principle. Louis Freeh, trained by decades climbing the ranks of the Bureau, worried about giving even the slightest hint that violence earned power in America. Both recognized that an error would echo for generations. Their advisors debated the boundaries of the First Amendment, the role of media, the nature of terror in the age of information, and the shifting politics of fear. In the thick of the debate, both were haunted by the possibility of going down in history as the ones who made the wrong choice, either by bowing to a terrorist or by allowing bloodshed that hindsight would deem preventable. Complicating matters further was the role of the New York Times and the Washington Post. Their editors too agonized over their responsibilities. Would they become the tools of terrorism by fulfilling its demands? Or could the very act of publication, as some in the Bureau argued, bring about a breakthrough? Perhaps the public, recognizing something in the manifesto, would hand authorities the clue that had eluded them for almost 2 decades. The unspoken subtext was always, what if we're responsible for the next victim, whichever path we choose? The debates extended well beyond the scope of traditional crime. Government philosophers, speechwriters, and crisis consultants entered the fray, some warning that caving to threats would corrode the country's very sense of order, others positing that modern media made traditional boundaries obsolete anyway. There were arguments about copycat crimes, the chilling of public discourse, and the global consequences for how the United States handled its own monsters. Each scenario was modeled, each possible move scrutinized from every imaginable angle. Internally, stress levels skyrocketed. Off the record, some senior agents later admitted they'd never felt such psychological pressure, both for the consequences now and the paths history might retrospectively judge them for. In the final weeks, the case became more than just a criminal investigation, it was a mirror held up to American democracy. The Unabomber, enforcing the issue, had discovered a fissure in the heart of American government, the relentless tension between freedom and safety, between order and chaos, between the values a country espoused and the measures it was willing to take to protect them. As the days counted down and the threat of new bombs loomed, paranoia crept through Washington. The next mistake could be fatal, not only to the next victim of a bomb, but to the country's sense of itself. At last, after a string of sleepless nights and marathon strategy sessions, the consensus formed. Reno and Freeh, together with the heads of the largest news organizations and with the cautious blessing of the White House, decided to authorize publication, not in order to capitulate, but as a calculated gambit. The idea was not to satisfy the Unabomber, but to flush him out. By letting his words into the open, they hoped someone somewhere would recognize the style, the obsessions, the patterns of thought. The hope was faint, but it was all they had left. For those leaders, the relief of making a decision was haunted by a newfound anxiety. Had they just granted a platform to evil, or bought time with prudence? Across America, people debated their reasoning, but those at the center of the storm knew that the real consequences, for better or worse, might never be fully known. That is the curse of leadership in the shadow of terror, the certainty that every move matters, but the knowledge that not one of them offers true safety or absolution. A sign from within the family. Amidst thousands of tips, leads, and wild theories that flooded into the FBI following the publication of the Unabomber's manifesto, none would carry more weight or more heartbreak than the one that emerged quietly from the confines of a concerned family. The Kaczynskis were hardly an ordinary American family, but up until the spring of 1995, they had managed to keep their burdens private. David Kaczynski, Ted's younger brother, had for years oscillated between confusion, admiration, and growing worry about his reclusive sibling. Ted Kaczynski, once considered a child prodigy, had devolved into a ghost, a figure who lived in isolation, communicating sporadically and with an odd intensity that lingered long after every letter. After the Unabomber's 35,000-word treatise appeared in the Washington Post, David's wife, Linda Patrick, sat at the kitchen table one evening with the newspaper spread before her. As she read, unease crept in. The tone, the cadence, the furious yet almost scientific style, there was something chillingly familiar about it. She called David over, and as the words poured across the page, a silent alarm rang in both their hearts. Ted had sent countless rambling letters over the years, letters dissecting technology, railing against modern society, sometimes lapsing into philosophical rants eerily similar to the screed that now haunted the nation's conscience. For days afterward, David wrestled with his conscience. Turning in his brother meant not just betraying flesh and blood, but forever fracturing his family's world. The Kaczynskis had already endured pain, divorces, lost connections, years of awkward silences and missed birthdays. At the same time, the ethical burden weighed heavily. If Ted was truly behind the bombings, how many more would suffer while suspicion festered? David feared catastrophe either way. If he stayed silent, and Ted struck again, that guilt would be unbearable. If he spoke up and was wrong, he would lose the last thread tethering him to his brother. It was a moral prison with no comfortable exit. David began poring over old letters and documents from Ted's sparse correspondence. With growing unease, he noted phraseology, arguments, and even word patterns that seemed almost interpolated from the manifesto. He compiled a package of writings, essays, rants, point-by-point takedowns of modern science that bore the unmistakable mark of the same mind. Linda quietly encouraged him to contact authorities, but David hesitated, torn between hope that he was mistaken and terror that he was not. Eventually, David reached out to Susan Swanson, a private investigator and former social worker whom he trusted to act discreetly. She became the family's intermediary, and together with a mounting sense of dread, they approached professionals at the FBI. The first conversation was tentative, almost apologetic. What if I'm wrong? What if this is just coincidence? David wondered aloud, his voice a low murmur over the telephone. The agent on the other end listened with gravity, understanding the high emotional stakes. Quietly, the Bureau requested samples of Ted's writing. With a heavy heart, David provided them. Linguistic analysts went to work. They compared Ted's phrasing, sentence construction, and rhetorical flourishes to the manifesto, looking for a genetic fingerprint in prose. The more they scrutinized, the more the similarities stacked up. It wasn't just the content, the rare vocabulary, the rhythm, the idiosyncratic punctuation. It was the fury and philosophical rigor embedded in the syntax. A kind of psychological DNA that made the link undeniable. Even as the investigation intensified, David and Linda lived through a stretch of nightmarish waiting. Every phone call from the FBI tightened a knot in their stomachs. Every fresh news report about the Unabomber sent them spiraling with anxiety and guilt. They avoided the press, kept up a facade of normalcy, but behind closed doors, David replayed every memory of his brother, the brilliant Harvard student, the idealistic young man, and finally the troubled hermit whose radicalism turned violent. Meanwhile, the FBI task force was revitalized. For nearly 20 years, agents had chased ghosts and dead ends. Now, a single lead from within the family offered the first glimmer of resolution. Surveillance details were quietly put in place around Ted's Montana cabin. Postal records, employment histories, and witness interviews were conducted with renewed urgency. The team's linguists met regularly, offering updates on the increasingly airtight case tying Ted Kaczynski to the decades-long rampage. But even as justice loomed closer, the personal tragedy deepened. David and Linda were soon drawn into a legal and emotional maze that upended their lives. Their anonymity evaporated as the investigation continued, and the struggle between loyalty, morality, and public safety dominated every conversation. Questions from journalists would later haunt them. Did you ever suspect? What was it like to turn in your own brother? Could you have prevented his isolation, or was he always destined to fall away from society? In the end, it was the willingness of a brother to confront the unthinkable, to risk everything in the hope of putting a stop to needless violence, that proved pivotal. The sign from within the family was not a neatly wrapped clue left at a crime scene, but the slow, painful accrual of memory, language, and gut feeling. It was a human decision made under the harshest of conditions, reminding the world that even the darkest crimes are often intertwined with the most ordinary moments of conscience and kinship. For the Kaczynskis, the resolution would come at an immeasurable cost, the loss of family as they knew it, and a legacy forever marked by one reluctant act of immense courage. American-style brain games. The struggle to unmask the Unabomber wasn't simply a technological or forensic race. It was, at its core, a battle of American wits, shaped by the unique ethos of law enforcement and the intellectual chess match between hunter and hunted. In the high-stakes showdown that unfolded across 2 decades, the investigation morphed repeatedly, exposing both the strengths and limitations of the nation's best minds, and showcasing how American tradition, ingenuity, and stubbornness collided in pursuit of an invisible adversary. From the earliest days after the first bombs exploded and the moniker Unabomber was coined, the pursuit drew together agents of differing backgrounds. Seasoned G-men trained in the methodical grind of the FBI, postal inspectors with a knack for deciphering patterns in the endless stream of mail, behavioral scientists obsessed with unraveling the wild tangle of the bomber's mind. Each cohort brought their distinct American flavor to the hunt. Some favored the hard logic of evidence and deduction, others leaned on intuition refined through decades of cracked cases, and some believed absolute immersion into the unspoken language of the bomber was the route to revelation. Yet, their efforts frequently collided with the limitations of technology and bureaucracy. In an era when computers sputtered compared to today's standards and DNA analysis was an emerging science, the case was built on painstaking comparison, guesswork, and a stubborn belief that, given enough time and effort, no mystery could resist solution. Teams pored over the ripped envelopes, scanned fingerprints under primitive microscopes, and mapped with red yarn the webs of bomb locations across America's coasts and heartland. The hunt acquired its own rhythm, slow, frustrating, but never yielding to despair. If one approach failed, another was debated and tried. It was the American approach, dogged, sometimes contradictory, but never short of resolve. This intellectual arena was never static. Task forces swelled and shrank in response to every new clue or dry spell. Agents were rotated as fresh perspectives were sought and fatigue set in. The FBI's vaunted Quantico profilers expended months drafting psychological portraits. Some detailed and nuanced, others wide guesses. Was their quarry an embittered academic, a loner with a manifest, or a member of some unidentified radical underground? Debates raged, memos thickened in file drawers, and all the while the Unabomber pressed on with his own designs, always adapting, always a step beyond the dragging net. The American legal system also played its role in this game of wits. With every package that detonated, public pressure mounted. Congressional hearings demanded accountability, and a restless media, living by the pulse of sensational headlines, magnified every revelation and every setback. Investigators found themselves working under the dual glares of public fear and administrative impatience. Yet this same scrutiny honed their sense of duty. For each misstep broadcasted or theory lampooned in the press, there was more incentive to crack the code. Then came the more unconventional methods, the pivots that marked American creativity at its best. Tasked with tracking an adversary who seemed to slip from every snare, the FBI drew on new disciplines. Forensic linguistics, a field scarcely recognized until the Unabomber's manifesto and letters became central clues, advances in psychological profiling, computational comparisons of written language. At the same time, bold agents began working with a level of openness that was unusual for a traditionally secretive institution, enlisting help from university experts and independent researchers. This embrace of outside intellect reflected a distinctly American zeitgeist, the willingness to leverage broad networks, to rise above professional ego in the face of national crisis. Of course, the path to a breakthrough was winding and littered with mistaken assumptions. Early optimism about the power of behavioral profiling gave way to frustration, as the Unabomber's apparent contradictions, his ability to be methodical and unpredictable, his intellect coupled with brutal violence, defied easy categorization. Even the FBI's best analysts sometimes found themselves trapped in the bomber's own web of misdirection. Each cryptic message and each carefully engineered device seemed to taunt the authorities. "Do you truly think you can catch me?" A turning point arrived with the publication of the Unabomber's 35,000-word manifesto. Suddenly the game was elevated to a national intellectual contest. The manifesto was not just an ideological rant, it was a gauntlet thrown at America's entire investigative apparatus. Linguists pored over line after line, linking obscure phrases and concepts back to letters and publications in libraries and academic circles. Machine comparisons of text style, statistical analysis of word choices, and the search for hidden identifiers all became part of the relentless campaign to match words to a human being. Yet behind the machinery and courtroom dramas lay the old-fashioned American capacity for improvisation. When algorithms and patterns failed, agents went back to basics. Knocking on doors, tracking postal routes, interviewing distant acquaintances, and re-examining even the most trivial details. The willingness to combine state-of-the-art science with blue-collar detective work became a hallmark of the investigation. Every phone call, every late-night meeting, every cross-out on a corkboard marked a new bid in the game of wits. This resourceful culture extended beyond the Bureau's walls. Newspapers, recognizing the historic stakes, took calculated risks when they finally agreed to print the manifesto, hoping public awareness would flush out a lead that elite investigators had missed. And indeed, it was an ordinary citizen, acting on a tangle of intuition, memory, and moral resolve, who delivered the pivotal clue the authorities needed. The collaborative tension between officialdom and the public reflected the strengths and quirks of the American system, sometimes dazzlingly efficient, sometimes slow and fractious, but often resourceful in ways that no centrally planned operation could predict. At its heart, the duel between the FBI and the Unabomber became a parable about the character of the United States itself. There were moments of hubris and moments of humility, episodes of brilliance punctuated by gaffes, experiments that combined intuition, chance, and sheer determination. This kind of struggle, where dogged persistence, openness to new ideas, and cultural flexibility proved just as important as technical prowess, could only have played out the way it did in America. In the end, the resolution of the case wasn't owed solely to science, tradition, or blind luck. It emerged from an intricate blend of institutional memory, analytical innovation, and human instinct, all quintessential elements in the American tradition of crime-solving. The game of American wits, a contest played on the largest stage imaginable, remains not only a testament to national resilience, but also a reminder that to win against the unknown, it sometimes takes the whole messy, inventive, and stubborn spirit of a country in arms. The raid in Montana, closing the net on the Unabomber. The April morning in 1996, when the FBI closed in on Ted Kaczynski's remote Montana cabin, has become the stuff of American criminal legend. For nearly 2 decades, the Unabomber, anonymously sending deadly packages and manifestos, had been the phantom at the heart of the largest manhunt in U.S. history. But when the Bureau finally prepared to swoop in, the situation was anything but simple. A mix of painstaking surveillance, meticulous crisis planning, and the tense psychology of taking down someone who, for so long, had seemed untouchable. The search for the Unabomber had reached a fever pitch following the break provided by Ted's own family. For months leading up to the raid, FBI agents quietly encircled his life in tiny Lincoln, Montana. Surveillance teams tracked his habits, observed the routines of the reclusive hermit, and plotted every possible approach to his fortified shack, a rough wooden structure that looked more shed than shelter, tucked into the pines like a survivalist's afterthought. The area itself was unforgiving. Frigid nights and unpredictable spring weather battered the agents as they worked. Locals eyed unfamiliar cars and faces with suspicion, never suspecting that national headlines had come to roost among their quiet, off-the-grid neighbors. Despite Ted's isolation, the situation was delicate. Investigators worried that, sensing discovery, he might destroy evidence or worse, resort to violence. The Unabomber was no ordinary suspect. He was a meticulous planner who'd constructed dozens of ingenious lethal bombs, some disguised so cleverly that even trained technicians missed the cues. There were valid fears that his shack might be booby-trapped, or that he might have wired the structure to explode upon entry. The FBI also knew they could not risk a public spectacle or trigger a standoff. Lincoln was a small town, and rumors traveled fast. Long before the actual day of the raid, law enforcement pored over blueprints, early photographs, and satellite images to sketch every inch of Kaczynski's property. Task force leaders staged tabletop exercises, playing out every possible twist. What if Ted fled? What if the house exploded? Would they need to negotiate, or would it come to violence? Veteran agents with experience in hostage negotiations and tactical units reviewed scenarios far removed from routine arrests. This wasn't simply about capturing a perpetrator, it was about preserving evidence that would prove a decades-long case and, equally important, about ensuring that no one, suspect or agent, lost their life in a potentially explosive confrontation. All the while, Kaczynski remained a ghost in physical form but a presence in every agent's mind. Oswald Hazeltine, a lead agent on the ground, later recalled that the greatest challenge was psychological, balancing the obsessive caution required by the bomb maker's reputation with the pressure from Washington for a swift, clean arrest. Every fiber of training told the agents to tread gently, check every hinge and floorboard, and not underestimate the mind that had outwitted so many for so long. As dawn broke over the pines in early April, the Bureau's final move went into effect with military precision. In unmarked vehicles, teams crept up the mountain roads, silently surrounding the cabin on foot under cover of darkness and dense forest. The operation was spearheaded by a SWAT team, with bomb disposal experts close behind. Their instructions were clear: secure the cabin, preserve any evidence, and, above all else, neutralize any immediate danger. Agents watched as Kaczynski, gaunt and bearded, emerged from the shack in the first light, entirely unaware he was at the center of a silent storm. He was confronted by plainclothes agents who lured him a safe distance away by knocking and calling him about supposed local land issues, an approach chosen expressly to keep both suspect and evidence clear of booby traps. The seconds ticked past with surreal normalcy. By the time Kaczynski realized he wasn't talking to a neighbor, it was too late. The SWAT team moved in, cuffed him, and read him his rights with almost anticlimactic efficiency. There was no shootout, no dramatic outburst. The country's most notorious bomber surrendered with barely a word. With the suspect in cuffs, the cabin search began, a painstaking, nerve-wracking process. Officers donned heavy bomb suits and methodically swept the structure for tripwires, concealed devices, and chemical hazards. The shack was shrouded in filth and clutter. Thick stacks of journals, scraps of newspaper, trial-and-error prototypes of bombs, rusty hand tools, and battered cookware filled every corner. On one makeshift workbench, a nearly completed explosive device stood, a chilling reminder of how close yet another attack might have been. Embedded in the chaos were reams of handwritten logs, crude diagrams of timing mechanisms, and lists of would-be targets. In one corner, a stash of bomb-making materials was concealed inside hollowed-out logs and plastic buckets. The agents moved at a crawl, cognizant of the delicate balance between evidence preservation and the very real possibility of a deadly accident. The entire process took hours, as teams rotated in and out of the suffocatingly cramped, poorly lit structure. Even after marking every hazard, bomb technicians spent days and then weeks cataloging the evidence, the most comprehensive and damning trove ever recorded in the case. For the national investigation, the discovery inside the cabin was nothing short of a gold mine. Here, at last, was proof tying years of unsolved bombings to a single individual, an arsenal of chemicals, fully assembled bombs, unfinished devices, and perhaps most critical, drafts of the Unabomber manifesto in Ted's own hand. The handwriting matched what had been sent to the major newspapers the year before. Fingerprint analysis, typesetting idiosyncrasies, and the distinctive phrasing all aligned with the packages that had terrorized America for years. Media coverage of the raid was feverish, albeit hampered at first by a total lockdown of information. Reporters descended on Lincoln in waves, stunned to discover that the man behind so much horror had lived in poverty and obscurity, seen by neighbors as a harmless eccentric. Days before, few in the tiny enclave suspected they shared a zip code with the infamous Unabomber. Now, cameras captured every angle of the battered cabin as trucks hauled away boxes of evidence under armed watch. For local authorities and the broader law enforcement community, relief mingled with awe and exhaustion. Some agents grew almost emotional at the thought that years of investigative dead ends had been conquered not through high-tech wizardry, but by painstaking determination, luck, and the courage of those who had betrayed family for the greater good. Newscasters replayed the moment of capture while commentators asked what it all meant for America's sense of safety. If the world's most wanted bomber could be living in a woodland hut, invisible for years, what other menaces might lurk, and how could society ever let its guard down? Yet for those directly involved in the raid, the work was just beginning. FBI analysts would spend months, and eventually years, combing through the evidence, reconstructing the Unabomber's twisted journey from prodigy to pariah. Criminal psychologists analyzed Ted's journals, searching for clues about motive, escalation, and regret. Forensics experts created timeline after timeline, matching homemade devices to victims and mail trails stretching across state lines. Prosecutors prepared a case so built on evidence that a trial seemed almost unnecessary. Kaczynski's arrest marked the end of one kind of fear, but opened up new questions about the limits of technology, the persistence of human cunning, and the vulnerabilities built into even the strongest societies. In the weeks that followed, the Montana landscape slowly returned to its rhythms, but the shadow of the raid lingered. Ted Kaczynski was flown under maximum security to a federal holding facility, and his cabin, reviled and mythologized in equal measure, became a site of somber pilgrimage for lawmen, journalists, and even a few curious locals. For years, the battered wooden shack would serve as tangible evidence that evil can sometimes thrive not in grand palaces, but in obscurity, at the edge of civilization. For the agents who brought the hunt to a close, the Montana raid was both victory and cautionary tale, a demonstration of the power of teamwork, patience, and calculated risk, but also a reminder that pursuing the shadows of human darkness remains one of law enforcement's most daunting callings. The lessons learned in taking down the Unabomber would echo for generations, ensuring that every major manhunt since has paid close attention to both the hard science and the deeply human questions at the heart of investigation. The final act. Ted Kaczynski's arrest in the spring of 1996 sent shockwaves rippling through the American consciousness, but it was only the beginning of the Unabomber's long denouement. What remained was a sprawling legal, cultural, and psychological reckoning, a final act both public and deeply private that would challenge the nation's sense of justice, closure, and the boundaries between monstrosity and humanity. The process began with Kaczynski's transfer to a high-security federal facility in Sacramento, California, a surreal journey that took him from the remote quiet of his Montana woods to the harsh incandescence of a world's spotlight. Escorted by U.S. Marshals, detained in chains, and watched by the glare of 1,000 news cameras, Kaczynski looked every bit the haunted figure America had imagined. Disheveled beard, haunted stare, gaunt frame weighted equally by years of solitude and the gravity of his crimes. Yet in the public mind he was no longer an unknowable ghost. He was flesh and blood, real, fallible, and suddenly both fascinating and repulsive. The legal machinery cranked into high gear. Federal prosecutors charged Kaczynski with multiple counts of murder, use of weapons of mass destruction, and an array of mail and bomb-related offenses. The indictment, running dozens of pages, laid bare the scale of his campaign. 16 confirmed bombings, 3 deaths, more than 24 wounded, and a terrified nation forced to reorganize daily life around the bare possibility that the mail might harbor death. From the outset, prosecutors sought the death penalty, a move welcomed by some survivors and families but debated fiercely in public. The Justice Department assembled a legal dream team led by seasoned prosecutor Robert Cleary, who pledged to hold Kaczynski accountable, not just for the destruction wrought but the decades-long siege of anxiety he'd inflicted. Victims' impact statements were prepared with raw candor. Family members rehearsed trembling testimony. Early pre-trial hearings were swarmed by reporters eager for the most minuscule details: what Kaczynski ate, how he responded to guards, even the books he read in his cell. America's need for answers was, by this point, insatiable. Yet, the trial almost never happened. First, Kaczynski's defense, an eclectic team led by public defenders Quinn Denvir and Judy Clark, waged a quiet war against the death penalty and ultimately, against their own clients' wishes. Their initial strategy focused on Kaczynski's mental state, drawing from his childhood isolation, history of psychological troubles, and a slow, chilling descent into radicalization. They raised the possibility of an insanity defense. The argument, Kaczynski wasn't just a criminal, he was profoundly mentally ill, consumed by a mania that made him unable to control his actions. Kaczynski, fiercely intelligent and stubborn, rejected this characterization. To him, the insanity plea wasn't just an insult, it was a denial of his beliefs as dangerous as any jail cell. He demanded the right to represent himself, and railed against efforts to paint him as mad. For weeks, the legal team sparred in tense private meetings and public motions. Observers wondered if justice would be fractured, either by the spectacle of a madman defending the indefensible, or by a system unable to recognize the complexity of evil. In the end, a compromise emerged, equal parts strategy, mercy, and hard pragmatism. Rather than risk an unpredictable trial or the spectacle of a man determined to sabotage his own defense, prosecutors offered Kaczynski a deal: plead guilty to all charges in exchange for life in prison without parole, and spare the nation, or at least the survivors, the agony of a lengthy, media-fueled legal battle. After agonizing deliberation, Kaczynski accepted. In January 1998, he stood before the court, admitted his guilt in calm, clipped sentences, and was formally sentenced to life at the federal ADX Supermax prison in Colorado, a fortress designed to house America's most notorious and dangerous offenders. With the verdict, the legal system found its closure, but the greater cultural aftermath had only begun. The Unabomber's story bled into the nation's psyche. Hundreds of articles, television specials, documentaries, and academic treatises sought to explain, exorcise, or even mythologize the man in the cabin. Newspapers ran first-hand accounts from survivors and in-depth interviews with family members still wrestling with guilt and confusion. Within months, Kaczynski's name was transformed from headline horror into cultural shorthand, a reference for the unpredictable dangers lurking in modern life, and a symbol in wider debates about technology, alienation, and extremism. For years after the sentencing, journalists and researchers made pilgrimages to Lincoln, Montana, examining every artifact of Kaczynski's hermitage. His ramshackle cabin was dismantled, shipped to the FBI Academy at Quantico, and rebuilt in a kind of macabre museum exhibit, a physical warning about the intersection of brilliance, resentment, and violence. Pieces of evidence, handwritten journals, bomb fragments, rambling letters, became the subject of academic analysis and coffee table books alike. College courses on criminal psychology and domestic terrorism dissected every move, every detail of Kaczynski's campaign and his capture. The survivors, for their part, faced their own journeys of recovery. Some spoke publicly, eyes clouded with decades-old pain, about the price of survival, shrapnel wounds, post-traumatic stress, and the invisible burden of random violence. Others retreated from the public eye, seeking solace in anonymity. Victims and families held gatherings, remembered the slain, and debated what form justice or closure could truly take. For many, the knowledge that the Unabomber now lived in solitude behind concrete, steel, and inches-thick glass was a cold comfort, a reminder of the limits of both law and retribution. Academics and pundits, meanwhile, turned Kaczynski into a case study. Was he a cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked intellectualism or the tragic fallout of a society that failed to recognize and support outcasts? Was the Unabomber's campaign a dark mirror for America's growing anxieties about technology, surveillance, and alienation? Opposing camps emerged, some viewing Kaczynski as a symptom of modern malaise, others condemning any effort to find nuance in a story of calculated brutality. In on-campus debates and public op-eds, people parsed the core of his manifesto. How could such dangerous ideas fester, and did society bear any blame for letting them germinate in the shadows? The Unabomber's notoriety bled into popular culture. He became a fixture in true crime television, films, parodies, and novels. Musicians name-dropped him, authors fictionalized him into archetype, and conspiracy theories spawned in the darker corners of the internet. The bunker mentality, the paranoia sparked by mysterious packages, and the notion that even a recluse could hold a nation hostage remained persistent themes in American storytelling. Each new round of media coverage, especially surrounding anniversaries or the release of new information, revived the old anxieties and rekindled the strange, uneasy fascination with the mad genius in the woods. Within the walls of his concrete cell at Supermax, Kaczynski adapted to an existence shaped by routine, silence and almost total isolation. He wrote letters in cramped script to pen pals, exchanged clandestine correspondence with activists and researchers, and occasionally contributed essays on topics ranging from mathematics to criminal justice reform. Rumors persisted about his mental state. Some said he maintained lucid focus, others whispered of slow decline. He was, at once, the most publicized and the most unreachable inmate in America's penal system. Yet, the end of the Unabomber case never truly put an end to its mystery or the questions it posed. Legal analysts revisited every phase of the investigation, drawing lessons about the evolution of forensic linguistics and the future of profiling. Law enforcement agencies overhauled protocols, added specialized training, and poured resources into defending against lone wolf threats inspired by Kaczynski's infamy. Philosophers continued to debate the meaning of his crimes and their place in an era when alienation and technology often intertwine in dangerous ways. If there was closure, it was of a particularly American variety, incomplete, restless, alive with lingering unease. The Unabomber saga remains a cautionary tale and a national parable, a warning about the monsters that can grow in the shadows, but also about the collective strength required to stare into that darkness and respond. In the end, the final act was not just a legal conclusion, but a story that left the nation changed, forever aware of both its own vulnerabilities and its powers of resilience.